Delighted tonight to have our visiting filmmaker from Colorado. She's been at a conference in Irvine the last couple of days. But Erin oh, you just changed my embedded Espelie. Espelie, thank you. I had the emphasis on the wrong syllable earlier. Has a background in science and is the editor of Natural History magazine, but is also, as you will see, a wonderful experimental filmmaker exploring the boundaries of, say, poetics, science, and nature. And it's really a delight to host her for her first show in Los Angeles. So with that, please join me in welcoming
for hosting me in LA Filmforum and Projectionist. Here at the Egyptian, it's really special to be here in this setting. I'm so grateful to all of you who have come out to see these films. I just wanted to say a couple of things before we got started, and one is that tonight I'm premiering a new film. It'll be in the center section of the program. It's called Tenebrio Molitor. And I thought it would be fitting to tell you the etymology of that Latin name. Tenebrio means those who seek darkness, or another version of it is violent death spirits. And molitor means millers or consumers, those that break down. So I'm so thrilled to be sharing that for the first time with you all tonight as an audience. And the mealworms in that film are at some level representative of some of my interests in subject matter. As you'll see, I have a deep love of the entomological and a deep love of the natural world, and an aim to look at wildlife from a cinematic perspective that's in opposition, I would say, to mainstream representations of the natural world. The final thing I'll say is that we're starting the program with a film that recapitulates the evolution of life on this planet, called What Part of the Earth is Inhabited? And it really is a tribute to Darwinian evolution and thinking about our place on the planet, and how things have shifted so much since humans have proliferated to 7.7 billion. And we also are ending with a film that I would say is deeply evolution-based. And it's really thinking about what it means and if there are alternative ways of living in this multi-species world and seeing it a little bit differently. So thank you so much for coming. I'll be happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
So start by, we'll dive into some, or see if any of you have any first questions or comments, please. In the back there.
We want to begin by talking about, you prefaced some of your films by saying that you're interested in entomology and depicting entomology in a way that rubs against the grain of like mainstream nature film and television. Could you talk about that?
Absolutely. So a lot of my films are made in response to the True Life Adventure series that Walt Disney won his Academy Awards for in the 1940s and 50s, 48 films in total, of which I pulled the sound from for the 3 True Life Adventure films. But I think that started a precedent for voiceovers, for bombastic narration, for typically male narrators walking us through, often anthropomorphizing the creatures that we see, and also in Fantasia-like form, setting that to music, so that their behavior becomes highly scripted, even to the point where, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but apparently people would write to Walt Disney and say, how did you get the animals to move in coordination with the music or the sound? So it's shifted. I think it's a profound shift in the way we started to relate to the natural world. We started expecting that nature would be edited for us, that it would be exciting, that we would be thrilled, that we would, every time we went out into the natural world, we would see the blue whale smack its tail, we would see the cheetah make the catch, we would see the polar bear in close-up. So that shift, I think, has rippled out into our relationship with nature. And so certainly David Attenborough, the kind of Blue Planet, Planet Earth, all of these subsequent nature films have set a certain standard for the way we interact with wildlife. And I really want to question that, because I think it's actually having profound impacts in the way that we're seeing the world. And studies are actually showing that it's affecting the way in which conservation takes place. So the more that we see animals in these contexts, oftentimes there's a link to thinking that they're taken care of. Even if it's in, so there's a certain study that I'm thinking of in particular showing that if the more that we see chimpanzees, even if we see them on screen, even if we see them in a commercial, we think that they're protected. Because there's some kind of ubiquity there that makes assumptions about their level of conservation. So one, that's changing the way that we're relating. But it also, I think, makes us less likely to go into our backyard and appreciate what we're seeing there. Even if it's not dramatic, then we might not take the time to look at it. And the entomological, to come back to your question, is one of those places that I feel like is so rich and often overlooked. And insects don't get enough screen time. And they don't get enough big screen time, right? So I want to think about changing that. Why do we need the why are megafauna charismatic? Why can't some of these things be? And sometimes it's, a little tongue-in-cheek to put the bombastic music with the yellow jacket or something. But yeah, I think actually moving forward as we face 1 million species going extinct, we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. We're losing this, and I think it's a problem, and I think cinema is part of the problem. So not that I think I can fix it all, but I'm trying to draw some attention to it.
Tenebrio Molitor, are we actually watching these guys eating styrofoam? Is that what's happening? Or
no, I'm playing with that a little bit. They are not actually eating styrofoam. So I had access to these worms which were being farmed for human consumption. And for alternative protein sources. So it's called the Rocky Mountain Micro Ranch, and it's in downtown Denver in a shipping container. And so I had access to those, and I was just interested in them. And it was there that I started doing some research. Well, what is this species? What can I learn about it? And that was when I discovered a paper that just came out recently from a lab in Stanford, showing that this species of mealworm is capable of digesting styrofoam.
Are they also, are they molting all the time? Is that what's going on?
They are. Those are called exuviae. They're shedding, and so it changes their pigmentation.
So
although
the little white ones are the ones that have just molted.
That they've just molted, precisely. Yeah, but there is incredible color variation, which I found so inspiring, and the fact that they can live in those masses and are constantly tunneling away from light made me think about 7.7 billion people on this planet, this kind of mass collective living, what that looks like. And also I was fascinated that it turns out that it's not the mealworms themselves that can digest styrofoam, it's their gut microbiome. So if they're fed antibiotics, they can no longer break it down to carbon and hydrogen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Regular, at least the normal mealworms?
Yeah.
Did you get to taste any of the product?
I did. They make it into flour, they make it and grind it up, but then they also keep them whole. There are a number of restaurants in Denver that are topping their topping their meals with little dried mealworms. Not friendly for vegans.
But delicious on French fries. Please? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of the work that we saw tonight has, to me, this great texture to it. Like, it's very tactile, and sometimes moving into more of like, even like a haptic range, where the surface of the screen becomes really what you're playing with. I'm just curious if you want to talk more about your approach to those images, because they feel like maybe alternative images in the way that you're talking about the Yellow Jacket etymology, walking us through that space. But I guess more just your approach to how you're thinking about the images that you're showing us. There's so much tactility and texture and sort of surface.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to parse out that question because I think maybe certain films kind of speak to that haptic nature more than others.
I think definitely like the microscope piece to me is like where I started to feel kind of keyed to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I think in any kind of filmmaking that's a little bit more, off the beaten path, so to speak. I personally, at least, am looking for different ways that the moving image can work for us in coordination with sound. How can I create a different cinematic experience? What does it mean to put a non-human animal on the screen at large scale and have it work on us and be there? I often I rely a lot on animal sounds themselves. So for instance, a net to catch the light, I'm using a sound of the species of spider that actually communicates by vibration, but making that into the audible range. In feature film of mine that obviously we didn't see tonight, but I'm using bat echolocation and bringing that into the audible range. And I was using underwater sounds from seals and things like that in that last film. So yeah, I mean, definitely in the soundscape, I'm trying to work with giving us a different sensation. Yeah.
I want to go back to a couple of the things you brought up or from the first question. I'm curious about in trying to question the standards of nature film today. I'm curious about the issues of both the voiceover and the charismatic image, even if it's not megafauna. Doesn't it so even if we like change it from a megafauna to an insect, we still run the risk of sort of being lost in the charismatic image. And I'm curious about if you find it, I mean, by making beautiful films, I'm curious if you think they might, if they can as effectively question the structuring of a standard nature film.
Yeah, I think they can, because they have to kind of compete with that aesthetic, or not compete, but question it in some way. And I don't think the insects deserve to have a crappy image. I mean, I think they're beautiful, and so yeah, part of it for me is the process. I mean, kind of praxis, being in the moment of being behind the camera and feeling a different kind of relationship to them as well. Yeah, I've written a little bit about how, I mean, one other part of this that I would point to is that I think it's also about how one gets the images. I mean, like, how are you acquiring them? And part of my objection to some of the kind of grandiosity of Planet Earth, or even a film like Microcosmos, there are elisions that are taking place in the editing that and there is an expenditure involved that's so radical, right? I mean, the amount of money, the amount of time that goes into getting one shot. I don't know, the snow leopard shot or something took 8 years, and monastic, dedication of 3 cinematographers in a hide in isolation. Not to be blunt about it, but also, why not? The carbon footprint of that, the enormity of that, is something that going forward I think we have to really think about. To what extent are we doing that? And for me, it goes heart and parcel with science itself. Like, what is the act of science? When does it become futile to ban another bird? To only know that it's going to go extinct, or but we are changing that one bird's experience on the planet. And so that was kind of one of the things I'm getting at in Silent Springs, the microscope film, is that idea of a kind of failure of science. And I would point to cinema too, like a failure of cinema to change us. Like, we are so, we have listened so little to Rachel Carson. That was made on the 50th anniversary of the publication of Silent Spring, and it was a look at for me, at how science at some level offered us the truth, and we couldn't absorb it, and we couldn't make the changes. The cultural machinery was in such motion. I'm dragging on here, so I'll wrap it up, but you get the idea. So I think that for me there's also some ideas, larger ideas about cinema.
Well, it's an interesting thing there, because I mean, in one sense, one could say, like, science offers us not the truth, but like one set of facts that we then can decide for some short period of time is a truth, or we can ignore it, or whatever. But I want to go back to a notion then of, like, if you're making films like these, listen to a hand in both worlds. But I mean, what is the nature, or how would you contrast, say, artistic thinking versus scientific thinking?
I wouldn't contrast them. I would compare them. I would say they're very similar.
In what ways?
In multiplicity of ways. An interest in observation, an interest in exploration, a practice that involves experimentation and iteration, and I am anti two cultures. I am very interested in the methodologies, blending and finding overlap, as many people have been for many centuries. Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. No, I was just going to say that I do very much agree that your work can challenge the typical wildlife vision, and I feel like your work teaches me to see nature the way that Annie Dillard's writing teaches me to see nature, and it gives me access so that when I walk through a parking lot and see a leaf falling or insects, or I go and take a hike, I have access to the beauty around me in a way that planet Earth doesn't give me access to. Even though it is showing me these incredible images, I won't ever be able to actually experience those images. And so to me, that's what's so profound about this work, and that connection does lead to change, and change in our behavior. And teaching children, especially, I'm a teacher, and teaching children to connect with and love their backyard flowers and insects is what will eventually lead to their decisions as an adult to work towards saving the environment, more than teaching them about the rainforest being cut down miles away from them with no connection or agency that they can take. So I just want to say thank you for that. And it's not really a question.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it makes me think about It makes me, there's the recent social science study coming out that looked at polar bears in particular as turning out to be alienating at some level, because the farther away something is, the more representational it becomes and the less concrete for people. So, I mean, it kind of goes back to Wendell Berry, you know, this idea of the local versus the global. How do you make some actual alterations in what you're doing and what you're thinking? Yeah.
To make the case for exotic images being brought in after serve a purpose,
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the name of the kid who did it, but it was a young guy working with someone else on a very expensive project of filming the calving of icebergs. I'm sure everybody's seen those
Oh,
shots.
Chasing Ice.
What's his name?
Chasing Ice, Jeff Orlowski.
Yeah, which
he's-
was an elaborately expensive, techno-expensive, time-expensive product. But that particular series of images that blew everybody's minds serve a pretty strong purpose. And there's something to be said for the fact that the previous president, the one before, banned it was the one before the last one,
Bush.
banned images of our young people coming back dead from being killed overseas. It's now, whereas those images were integral to stopping the war in Vietnam because everybody was heavily heated up about it, not seeing those images is a dearth, and as a result there's a dearth of response. But I really wanted to ask you about that remark that you quoted about in 8 years what starts out as science becomes culture. Is that, whose line is that? Is that actually something that is a text editor you experience?
That's Lynn Margulis.
Okay, that's her remark. Boy, it's,
Yeah.
and what do you say something about that? It's like one wants more.
Yeah, I mean, that's our culture at some level too. It's, if it's not now, we're not as interested in it, or it becomes, it migrates into the history books, kind of, so to speak. But for me, it comes back to that question of art and science differential, and how we tend to prioritize the newest study, myself included. I'm guilty of that. Like, oh, this study just came out, I'll cite this. But so often we're forgetting so much of what's come before. There's cultural amnesia, there's also just general, impossibility of keeping up with the extraordinary immensity of data, science, images, all of it. We're in this profusion, and for me that makes me question this comment that, well, we need these images coming back to us. We need them. The thing is that we're dealing with a bit of climate ennui. We're dealing with people of public depression, and Svetkovich has written about this. There's this kind of understanding about how much is going wrong and how little we have power to stop it, and so there's a growing tendency to turn away from that, or feel futile in our efforts to stop it. And sometimes images are the problem. Sometimes that profusion is problematic. I'll also say about the Chasing Ice film, which is Jeff Orlowski, but really James Balog, the photographer who Jeff is chronicling. He was doing that for the sake of collecting data. So it's this really interesting overlap there, and at some level the film, I think, sensationalizes and dramatizes it on a human level of, will the photographer be able to climb the mountain with his injured knee? And there becomes this kind of sensationalized human drama to it, which is very effective, and has so many people have seen it, understood something in a new way. Same thing with Chasing Coral. These films are powerful and potent, but I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm taking the human component out of it.
Well, I think that without that whole drama of the guys and their suffering and having that shoot, just that killer shot of watching that calving occur is the money shot without, would it be fine without all the other crap? Without the whole housing and the humanizing of it?
Yeah.
So the image itself.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very powerful.
And another question for you about the hummingbird poop. I have never seen that anywhere.
Isn't that incredible? The scatological, practices of birds are incredible. They keep very clean nests.
And
Some
they're
of them,
immaculate when they leave. So they have not pooped all over the inside.
it depends on the species. So interestingly enough,
Wasn't that a poop-covered nest that we saw at the end? Was it white nest?
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
so some species of birds are not so meticulous.
Yeah.
And in some species, the parents actually remove the excrement, like with their beaks, and take it out to clean the nest. But one note about the hummingbird nest that I just love, that I think is so fascinating, is that it's made out of spider silk. So it literally grows as the nestlings grow. It's one of these. That was for me one of the discoveries of making the film, and for me that also is this intersection of art and science. I really felt like I was an ornithologist or something making these discoveries, and I know some of them weren't new, but that process of understanding really ties back to my history with natural history and studying wildlife behavior, and I kind of always am looking to get closer in that way, and this allowed me to do that a little.
How long were you filming that nest?
Oh, I put it at the end credits, didn't you
Oh, you
see?
did?
July 2nd to August 4th.
What was what?
July 2nd to August 4th.
Okay.
Yes, and that for me was another point, is that I wanted to be very specific about filming time,
Yeah.
in contrast to some of the other, nebulous. You don't know if you're watching the same fox, or you've watched like 5 different foxes do the same thing that the editors are putting together to make it look like a single family or something like that. Anybody?
Please.
Sorry, I'm very nervous to speak publicly.
Don't
but
be.
I'm a wildlife biologist, so obviously this is like hitting home in a lot of ways and making me very excited that I got to see this and that other people are seeing this too. But at the beginning you introduced it and you talked about a little bit of like how Darwinian evolution is part of your whole systematic approach, I think. Can you maybe key out some points where that was particularly present, or what you were kind of trying to get at with that?
Yeah, so in that first film, What Part of the Earth is Inhabited, I was, to a certain extent, tracing Darwin's footsteps or boat paths on the Beagle in the Galapagos and in Chile. And I was so fascinated by thinking about Darwin's perspective on species evolution and the way in which humans are now either hampering that, potentially ending that, or it's certainly at least part of it, and part of that conversation anyway. So in that film in particular, I set myself the task of trying to recapitulate the evolution of life on the planet in 6 minutes, from the Big Bang with my lens flares to a certain point. And then what I realized I was doing was I was trying to use the shots that I had taken and cut out all of the humans. So if I saw a croc foot, above the tortoise, I wanted to cut that out. And I realized that was my tendency, is I favored the animals. I didn't want humans muddying my picture, and that is, of course, so often what we do. I was just at the Huntington yesterday, and someone was trying to take a picture, and she said, "I'm just waiting until the people are out of the shot so I can get the shot." And I recognized that I was guilty of that too in this, and so at a certain point in the film, I backtrack and I literally go through all of the shots in reverse and show you that there's been a human in every one of those shots. And
for me, that kind of like spoke to conservation too, how it sort of at first felt like these were just animals existing with no humans around, and then you were like, oh, but we're everywhere.
We're everywhere. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it really, I guess, is as much about that as it is about Darwin. But I mean, it's so foundational to the way that we think about life on this planet. So I'm kind of always thinking about his influence and his practice, which is not perfect, obviously, and there are so many things that epigenetics, all of these things that were kind of undoing some of the things that he put forward. But again, it was this really critical juncture in which humans were de-centered, kind of like a Copernican revolution, right? For me, it's that same kind of moment. Same moment as recognizing that we have tectonic plates. Like, our Earth cracks apart. Our world cracks apart.
It's an interesting parallel. I don't know if you're familiar with Flaherty did a film on the Aran Islands.
Oh, yes, I know that film.
And in which he showed the age-old gathering of the seaweed and so forth, and doing their age-old things. And George Stoney later went back and made a film where he repeated the shots and showed that Flaherty's pan of the seaweed gathering practice stopped just short of where the modern factory would have been if he continued and gone 30 feet further, because he wanted to cut that out. He just wanted to have the old stuff.
Cinema is a game of, it's an illusion. It's all an illusion. We know that. It's nice when sometimes when a cinema, a maker will point that out to you in the moment and let you in on that a little bit. Yeah.
Please.
I'm interested in your decisions about film versus digital and when you make those selections, and also maybe this relates and maybe not, but I guess I just would love to hear a little more about a kind of chronological arc through like how your thinking has changed over the making of these, because we've seen, a fairly large chunk of years here.
Yeah.
And maybe that relates to digital and film, and maybe it doesn't, I don't know. But.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. That's a huge one, and it's one of those questions where I feel like I could talk for 2 hours, but I'll try just to talk for a minute. Yeah, it's at the heart of what I'm doing at some level, is this kind of analog digital, and I use that as much as I can as to kind of form a conversation around the current state of cinema, where we are in this particular moment, and to give us the full range of textures and affects. I mean, kind of to go back to that idea of the texture, the film grain, in contrast to the slickered digital image. That gives us such a different feeling, a different connection. So I'm working with Super 8, 16, and a whole host of different digital codecs to kind of think about, well, what is the range, and then playing with maintaining aspect ratio to a certain extent. So in A Net to Catch the Light, for instance, where I have that inset 4:3 aspect ratio held within digital context, for me that film and that whole series actually that's dealing with the Mandarin characters is this consideration of the analog digital, in part because of the light. So I'm really interested from a scientific perspective, a physiological perspective, how light differs for us. I mean, that's been an ongoing thing that Beyond Expression Bright touched on too, but this idea, Peter Kubelka had this idea that that a projector was like a domesticated sun, he said. But he was also really insistent on the differential between having a shutter cross in front of the projection versus a constant inundation of image coming with the digital. So I'm interested in that from a physiological perspective, what that differential feels like or does for us. But I'm most interested in the different light qualities, the literal wavelengths of light and how they differ, and then in turn how that affects us, our circadian rhythms, etc. So I think there's more to play with there, and I'm trying to keep thinking about how to do that, and not geek out too much on kind of some of those differences, and still make a film that is itself contained, but in so doing explore some of that. And then a
bit more on your evolution, since we did see from I guess your first film to your most recent film, right? So I mean, I think there is an evolution in your work. So if you have way of self-reflecting upon that, how you feel your own films have evolved, and also when, or alternatively, when have you found it more useful to use digital means than celluloid means?
Yeah. Well,
that's a simpler question.
Yeah, the simple answer to that is that, there's certain films demands it. So, for instance, I could never have made the Hummingbird film on with a Bolex. Like, I was already nervous enough about disturbing that poor bird and, not wanting to make any disturbing. I could never have done that on a Bolex. And just in terms of setting timers and getting enough space there, that had to be digital. But on another point of your question about the kind of way in which my films have shifted, I want to quote Deborah Stratman, one of my favorite filmmakers, who says that for her, and I feel this is true for myself too, that every film births another film. You can't just, say, oh, I would make this film now, or I would have made that film then, or it's like each one you couldn't have made without the other. And that's definitely true for me. That each one, I've learned something in the making, and it has something to do with what I just made, something that's changed or shifted and that I can go forward on. So
iterations,
yeah.
Please.
Maybe stepping back, but I'm just curious, if the sort of the blue light that you refer to emitted from screens that are representing commodified imagery of nature, dramatized commodified images of nature, are sort of short-circuiting our internal clocks. What do you sort of predict as the evolution or de-evolution of representations in mass culture of nature, and then how it affects a generation of conservationists that are coming after us?
Well, that's a huge question, but a very good one, something I'm really trying to think about. I think that I see our connections to nature through digital imagery right now as kind of moving into this increasingly mythical place. And so I think that one of our relationships to, let's say, the giraffe, or our kids, or our future generations are going to see that more like an animated creature than a living creature, because I think there's an attenuation that's happening as they have increasingly more experiences with animals through the digital image, and through increasingly smaller screens too. I think that's going to have a big effect. And then we could also go into a whole thing around games, but I think that's increasingly how kids are interacting. Even zoos, right? I mean, I think zoos will become obsolete at a certain point, and yet those are the only contexts where most people can see animals that are not the squirrel in their backyard. And so, yeah, what a strange place 50 years from now. What is our archive of the living world going to be for reflection? Is it all going to go towards CGI? I mean, the most recent Lion King. That's frightening to me, and that's definitely something, to go back to your question or comment about the digital too, is just trying to pay kind of close attention to when digital manipulation comes into play. So I relatively recently wrote this eco-manifesto for film, a little egotistically, but I was trying to think about it in terms of the history of Jean Pain-Levé and his 10 commandments for filmmakers. But one of mine is that whenever possible not to use CGI, because I do think that for kids they're going to see the image even increasingly as something not to be trusted. I mean, already it's not really quote unquote trustworthy, and we know that, but in a different way it's changing with CGI. So I don't know if I'm answering your question fully, but that's one of the things interesting. Yeah.
Any more? Please.
So kind of riffing on these questions of like epistemology, or tectonic plates rupturing, whatever. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit about circulation of like your films or kind of experimental films generally. Like you're discussing having your work maybe kind of counteract the work of representations of nature that we're already habituated to. So, but yeah, I imagine your films are not as widely seen as the recent Lion King remake. So yeah.
That's a great question. Something I grapple with and don't have a ready answer for in terms of the right answer of distribution. I believe a lot in seeing things together in community space. That's part of how I define cinema versus video, let's say. The fact that we can be in a shared space and see something and have a collective experience. So that has meant that for the most part, I don't have, readily available online versions of my film that might be able to distribute it to the masses more readily. But I'm comfortable with that and interested in having these kinds of conversations. And don't think that, again, as I said, I think we are in such an age of inundation that I think people need to take more care with what they ingest, imagistically, cinematically, and yeah, that's another hesitation I've had about kind of putting something out there just really open, kind of generally. But it's also the history of experimental avant-garde cinema. It's never gotten as many people in the seats as the films that filmmakers making narrative features get. But hopefully this kind of conversation can inspire people to think in different ways. Yeah.
With that, I think actually it's a good time to end the Q&A right now. Thank you all for coming tonight. She's here for a moment if you need to have a one-on-one, and
go get a drink.
and then we'll do a drink in a couple minutes as well.
Yeah.
But also, I think that they ask for is, since The Irishman is still in the big theater right now, that no conversations in the lobby, just like in here or out in the courtyard. But the sound travels down to the main theater from the lobby. Thank you all for coming. And we have more program notes for those of you that
The idea of leaving straight. It's very odd.
It is dumb.